Let me ask you if these phrases sound familiar, or if you've heard them at any point in time in your life. What is the point of philosophy? What does it do? We live in a culture that often repeats the same refrain that philosophy is abstract, that philosophy is detached, that philosophy is a luxury. Philosophers sit around interpreting the world while everyone else goes on to actually live in it. And this objection isn't entirely new. In fact, it's old, and some of these sentiments might be captured in Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, where he writes, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. But Marx did not arrive from this critique from the outside. He came from within a tradition that shaped him, challenged him, and ultimately forced him to break it apart. Some of the accusations pitted against his contemporaries and predecessors encapsulate the debates of the 19th century, the same century that would produce Hegel and Marx, the two thinkers who would permanently reshape political thought, economics, the humanities, and eventually provide the foundations for the Frankfurt School in critical theory. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Popular Philosophy, where in this episode we discuss Hegel to Marx. And at the center of this debate lies a conflict so old it has shaped entire civilizations. The debate between idealism and materialism. What is more fundamental, the world of the mind or the world of matter? The ideas that move history or the material conditions that might constrain them? This is the battleground into which Hegel steps and the very terrain Marx will later transform. To understand Marx's revolutionary turn, however, we have to first return to the thinker whose shadow he could never quite escape, Hegel. So part one, the architect of idealist dialectic, Hegel. If you watched the previous episode, you already know the contours of Hegel's life to some extent. So today we shift from the man to the mind, to the system that shook Europe. Hegel grew up in a world preparing to explode into revolution, politically, culturally, philosophically. He read Kant carefully and absorbed Kant's great insight that the mind doesn't just receive the world, it actively structures it. But Hegel thought Kant stopped halfway. Kant drew hard limits around reason, especially the thing in itself, the part of reality that humans never could fully know. For Hegel, that boundary was intolerable. In 1807, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel writes, "The true is the whole, the essence consummating itself through its development." Now hold on to this quote because I think it will become important later when we dive into Adorno. What does this mean though? It means that truth isn't static, truth unfolds, truth becomes. And the engine of this becoming is contradiction, what Hegel calls determinate negation. We discussed this in the previous video, but just a little recap. When something contradicts itself, that contradiction doesn't annihilate it. It pushes it forward, it forces its development. And here's where things get a little bit more interesting, and we can introduce another text from Hegel. This is the science of the logic. And Hegel begins the science of the logic with the simplest possible concepts: being, nothing, and becoming. So what is being? Well, you can think of being as the pure isness. And when you think of being, it's abstract. And when you think of the opposite of being, which is nothing, you can think of it as the pure is notness, I guess. And this is equally empty. And these two terms together, they kind of negate each other. And their collapse creates what Hegel thinks is more true, which is a movement known as becoming. And I'll give you a real life example. When you think of dawn, it's not fully night, not fully day. The transition itself is what's real. For Hegel, this is the key to reality. It isn't fixed, but it's a process. Contradiction isn't a flaw, it's the rhythm of our existence. And that rhythm becomes history. Hegel writes, "The life of spirit is not the life that shuns death, but endures and maintains in it." So history is spirit learning what it is, reason externalizing itself in our institutions, our cultures, our law, basically our forms of life, slowly unfolding toward freedom. And this is what we call absolute idealism. The real is the rational is the real. Hegel's system swept across Europe. It inspired governments, terrified rulers, and produced a generation of thinkers who believed history itself had a rational structure. And some of those figures who enjoyed Hegel's work were called the Young Hegelians, and among them, restless, brilliant, and increasingly dissatisfied, was Karl Marx. This leads us to part 2. Marx enters, Marx breaks, and Marx reveres. Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, a child of the Rhineland, a region shaped by both French Enlightenment and Prussian conservatism. He was brilliant early on, first studying law, then philosophy, and eventually falling under the spell of Hegel. In Berlin, Marx encountered the Young Hegelians, a radical group who believed if Hegel was right, then Germany must undergo cultural and political revolution. Figures such as Bruno Bauer, who emphasized the critique of religion, Ludwig Feuerbach, who argued that God was a projection of human essence. Marx was considered one of the most promising Young Hegelians and was expected to become a major philosophical figure. But he soon found that their approach was insufficient. The Young Hegelians criticized Christianity, monarchy, and culture, yet they remained trapped in the critique of ideas. What Marx wanted was a critique of society itself. He famously writes, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." The quote that I mentioned in the very beginning of this video. This is the moment Marx leaves idealism behind and steps into materialism. So, part 3, Marx's break, turning Hegel upside down. Marx did not reject Hegel's dialectic, he transformed it. He writes in the afterword of Capital, "My dialectical method is not only different from Hegel, but it is a direct opposite. In Hegel, the life process of the human brain is demiurgus, of the real world. With me, the ideal is nothing but material world reflected by the human mind." So, what does this mean? This is the heart of historical materialism. Idealism says that history is driven by ideas. Materialism says history is driven by material conditions, those being labor, production, power, property. Marx keeps the dialectic, but grounds it in the body, in the work, in the bread and wages, in the land, in the factories, in the real struggles of real people. In German Ideology, written in 1846, Marx and Friedrich Engels write, "The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life." This is a direct reversal of idealism. Consciousness, ideas, do not create life conditions create consciousness. And they go further. They say, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. When Marx said philosophers only interpret the world, he wasn't rejecting philosophy, he was challenging it to rise to the highest calling. And here lies the seed of critical theory in the Frankfurt School. To critique society, one must critique the structures that shape action, belief, and experience. In the text, Marx exposes ideology, the systems of ideas that hide the material realities of power. The ideas of the ruling class, they say, are in every epoch the ruling ideas. Ideology turns oppression into common sense, injustice into nature, and exploitation into the way that things are. By rooting critique in material life, Marx opens the door for a new kind of philosophy, one that is concerned with domination, agency, production, and the ways society misleads us about our own conditions. This is where the Frankfurt School will eventually enter. They will take Marx's materialism, Hegel's dialectic, and in some sense, Kant's notion of critique, and apply them to culture, media, psychology, psychoanalysis, fascism, mass society, technology, and ultimately, modernity itself. But that story begins in the next episode. So, in closing, if Hegel gave us the logic of history, Marx therefore gave us its engine. And if idealism gave us the horizon of freedom, materialism told us that freedom must be built with our hands. Thank you all so much for watching another episode of Popular Philosophy. If you found this video to be informative, learned anything, or enjoyed it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I look forward to bringing you more content in the next week.